Hiya folks, welcome to the show. I'm the Gladding Gladiator and it's my mission to talk about everything Disney animation on the internet. So, this is 10 years old now. Bet that makes you feel good about yourself. When Phineas and Ferb made its debut on the Disney Channel in 2007 after 15 years of development and failed pitches by Dan Povenmire and Jeff Swampy Marsh, whose name isn't actually Swampy, he just likes having his name be longer than everyone else's in the credits, it was entering during a very tumultuous time for the network. By this point, Disney had really begun enforcing its 3-season only rule, which by now had claimed almost all of its first slate of original animated shows. Kim Possible had returned after its initial cancellation for a 4th season, but was soon about to bow out again, and this time no amount of fan petitions or calls sent to the network were going to save it. So there was kind of this uncertainty of what would become of animated programming on Disney Channel. I mean, Nickelodeon has Spongebob and the Fairly Odd Parents, Cartoon Network has Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends and Ben 10, Disney Channel has The Replacements and The Emperor's New School. Good shows, but nowhere near the flagship franchise Disney needed. So everyone was asking what were they going to do. Then on August 17, 2007, we received our answer. Phineas and Ferb premiered and became an overnight worldwide sensation, the likes of which Disney TVA had never seen before and have not experienced since, with each new episode averaging 3 to 4 million viewers. And they capitalized the hell out of that success, with ridiculous amounts of merchandise, video games, and theme park attractions. And the series pretty much maintained that same level of popularity throughout its entire 8-year run, which would be impressive for any show, but this was airing on a network where the average series lasted about 3 years. But you already know about that. I mean, with how much stuff they pumped out, I'm sure at some point in your life you owned a Perry the Platypus t-shirt. We're here today because at the height of the show's popularity in 2011, they released a Disney Channel original movie starring the geometrically shaped characters titled Phineas and Ferb Across the Second Dimension. Now, this would normally be the part where I'd hold up my DVD copy of the film and say, let's get started, but I don't actually own it. The year the film released, I did actually receive the DVD for Christmas. However, despite it being ordered on Amazon UK, it was a Region 1 version, so nothing I owned could play it at the time. So we sent it back, and I never actually got the Region 2 version, so let's look at this movie. Now, in an earlier video, I did talk about this movie when comparing it to Candace Against the Universe. But it has been almost a year since then, and I'd like to think I've improved enough as a creator that I can do a much better job at revisiting this movie and the impact it had. Because despite the characters having their memories wiped at the end, this film had a marginal effect on the final years of the show that I feel is worth discussing. With that, let's kick things off by going in depth about the development and production of this film. We'll get through this quick as there isn't too much background information on the movie available. The film was first announced by Jeff Swampy Marsh in January 2010 during an interview with the Daily Telegraph. By this point, the series was in the middle of its 2nd season and the movie would be produced and aired alongside season 3. That has nothing to do with anything, I just wanted to say something else so this section wasn't just that one thing. With that, let's move on to talking about Phineas and Ferb the movie Across the Second Dimension in Fabulous 2D. I always love that little tagline and how it's a dig at all major animation studios, including Disney, for leaving traditional animation behind to focus on CG. That right there kind of tells you the type of movie you're in for. An incredibly fun passion project that's also going to have an element of self-awareness to it. One of the most admirable aspects of this movie to me is its structure. This movie is obsessed with Chekhov's gun to the point where I'm thinking of staging an intervention because the first act is loaded with it. Think of any major moment in the latter half of the film and you'll find there's a setup for it right at the beginning. The Platypulps, Perry's locket, the OWCA reconstructing Doof's and Nater's, Monogram telling Perry not to call between 3:30 and 4. However, when you aren't explicitly trying to look for this stuff, you hardly notice it because it's expertly disguised within the classic Phineas and Ferb formula we all know so well. I've always been a huge fan of movies based on cartoons that start out like a regular episode before the grand higher stakes plot kicks in. Yet most of the time, that portion of the movie is little more than giving existing fans a sense of familiarity, while also acting as very basic introduction to newcomers. However, this movie goes above and beyond by using the iconic episode structure to secretly build an incredibly strong foundation that the rest of the movie keeps calling back to. Of course, that's not even mentioning everyone's favourite setup and payoff in this film.
Harry, no! Not on the sofa.
I've had just about enough of you. Oh, what is on this?
However, the movie doesn't just use the repetitive formula of the series to hide its foreshadowing. The entire movie serves to essentially question the show and break almost all of its rules. I mean, it literally ends with Isabella kissing Phineas, right before they get their memories wiped. The restraining order keeping the two worlds of the show separated is lifted as Phineas and Ferb meet Heinz Doofenshmirtz. And this casual earth-shattering moment that fans had waited years for is the catalyst for the plot of the movie. However, this questioning of the show's universe is probably best summed up by Candace, who, after a good few months of failing to bust her brothers, tries to artificially make herself more mature, which causes her to gain some perspective and theorize that there is some mysterious force that always comes to take away the boys' inventions at the very last second. Now, the obvious joke here is that the mysterious force is only the series of coincidences caused by Heinz Doofenshmirtz's innators. But if you allow me to just put on my skepticals, I think it goes a little deeper than that. In essence, Candace is calling attention to the writers themselves, and how her entire world has been constructed from day one to always result in her defeat. And from there, you'd expect her to get frustrated or angry like she always does, but instead, all she's able to do is question why. Which is definitely the moment Candace became the show's most relatable character. This deconstruction of the show's logic is also a tool that gives this feature-length adventure its own unique energy and tone. Now, bear with me because I'm about to talk about Angry Phineas.
Get on the trike!
Phineas getting angry on the show, or even just expressing any emotion outside of pure optimism, was and still is a novelty. Even when facing a dire situation, most of the time Phineas can't muster anything more than acting mildly inconvenienced. So whenever he does get mad, mostly at the little things, it's always both shocking and incredibly funny. But now we arrive at the moment where Phineas and Ferb finally find out about Perry's double life, and Phineas is incredibly hurt to learn this, especially since he's forced to process all this during an intense chase scene. But this isn't Phineas getting upset over something trivial for the sake of comedy. This is being taken seriously. Now, people have very rightly criticised this frankly jarring shift in Phineas's character, but I do see what they're going for here. Taking an infrequent running gag from the show and using it to elevate the story by taking it seriously, as a way to try and create a character arc for the protagonist. It just wasn't really followed through on. Which, depending on how you look at it, is either a positive or a negative strike against the structural integrity of this film. But using Angry Phineas in this way does kind of send the message of, hey, you know those rules we've established for how the world and these characters behave for the past 4 years? Well, we're throwing them all out the window. You better buckle up because Triangle Boy is angry, we're in uncharted waters now, and anything can happen. Or at least, that's how I've always interpreted it. And from those creative choices, the movie starts to amount a level of heart that hadn't been seen too often in the series since the early days. Once you get to a certain point in the show, you don't really get scenes like Candace's birthday present for Linda or the entirety of Come Home Perry, as anytime the later episodes try something like that, they really crank up the melodrama for the sake of comedy. And while I don't think anything in this movie reaches that status of turning my face into Niagara Falls like those earlier moments, there is still a lot of really heartfelt interactions between the characters that were seldom seen on the show at the time. But that's enough pretentious analysis of character arcs and story structure. Well, for now, let's move on to gushing about the presentation of this movie. This will likely forever be the peak of the franchise from a musical and visual standpoint. The songs in this movie are geniusly woven into the narrative without ever feeling out of place with the rest of the show's discography. The one thing that makes or breaks a musical for me is if the songs are able to maintain a connection to the characters and their emotional journeys. That's not to say there isn't value in a musical that doesn't do that and is just here to present a few fun, memorable numbers, but the ones that manage to pull that off feel much more meaningful and personal to me. And this film does pull that off to a certain extent. It's Phineas and Ferb, so of course they are all well-written, pleasant songs to listen to, but most of the numbers here do have significance in the narrative, whether it be introducing a new character or something that sums up the main themes of the adventure. Brand New Best Friend is a great song that introduces Second Dimension Doofenshmirtz, who upon first impressions seems like a carbon copy of the same lovable, pathetic wannabe villain, until you remember, oh, right, evil dictator. And at several points, the song comes to a halt to show how different they are at their very core. And even all the visual references to other famous duos in cinema set to drive this point further. Then there's Summer Man, Where Do We Begin, which is essentially a theme song for the show, disregarding the theme song of the show. It perfectly sums up the adventurous and fun-loving spirit of the main characters, contrasting their perpetual optimism against this dark authoritarian world, literally bringing the colour back into the lives of the other dimension counterparts. Even the more montage or narration songs still properly express the characters' feelings. Take I Walk Away for example. In the film, the song is around 30 seconds long and is pretty much a throwaway joke meant to poke fun at these kinds of scenes in other movies, essentially parodying a third act breakup, except this takes place in the middle of the second act. Yet there is still this emotional connection. The on-the-nose lyrics still describe exactly what the characters are feeling in that moment. Then there's Mysterious Force, which got cut from the film, but had it stayed in, would have perfectly illustrated Candace's anguish at the idea of some omnipotent being that has more control over her life than she does. You're probably sick of me talking about the songs by now, so let's change gears and discuss the visuals. Well, the animation itself is mostly similar to a standard episode, meaning quite simplistic, but if you look closely enough, you'll find a certain level of detail that you have to admire. There was a notable budget increase for the action scenes, especially in the third act, which still looks stunning a decade later. But the true visual standout of this movie is the design of the second dimension Danville, which huge missed opportunity to not call this place Doofania, but whatever. Here the random splashes of triangles usually found in the show's background become incredibly controlled and uniform, sometimes incorporating text, which even if you don't notice it, subconsciously makes this very distinct from what we're used to and gives all the scenes a very unsettling feel to them. Then you have all the non-standard architecture and that sky. It may seem like an incredibly small detail, but these swirling vortex-like clouds and the colour scheme is possibly the best looking piece of art from the entire show in my opinion. It's so simple and chaotic, yet so damn effective at establishing how out of place our vibrant cast of characters feels in this muted world. But no feature is perfect, especially not those made for TV. And this film does have its fair share of decently sized problems. Nothing that could potentially harm the viewing experience, but things that upon every rewatch do become more and more noticeable. The biggest issue is the movie is trying to juggle way too many characters at once, much to the detriment of some of the series' main cast. Soon as Phineas, Ferb, Perry and Doof enter the second dimension, Danville and everyone in it gets pushed to the sidelines, except for a few scenes just to remind us that they're still here. Meanwhile, we focus on the other dimension counterparts who really don't do all that much. Second Dimension Buford gets some good jokes, Second Dimension Balji at least serves a purpose to the story, and Second Dimension Isabella, I could not tell you a single thing about her. She's in most of the second act, but is never really given a personality or does anything of value outside of just being a train conductor. Then after the OG characters are captured, they don't appear again until the very end as silent cameos, passing the baton back over to the characters the audience are familiar with and actually want to see in a Phineas and Ferb movie. While the main story of the movie is incredibly well told, it is kind of sad we have all these iconic characters just sitting around doing nothing until the plot has a use for them. I don't know how they would have fixed this, since bringing them on the main adventure would make it feel a bit too crowded. So the only thing they could have possibly done is make the movie longer and actually give them something to do. Like, the whole point of Isabella and the Fireside Girls is that they are incredibly capable and intelligent. Why not have them figure out where the boys landed, head to Doof's building and find the other Dimensionator plans? Then they put all the knowledge they've acquired from working on all the boys' inventions to good use and figure out a way to get them home. Yes, we lose the brand new reality song and sequence that accompanies accompanies it, but it would make the movie feel a lot more balanced and actually give a great character like Isabella something meaningful to do. I mean, as much as I love Stacy, I'm fairly sure she has more lines than Isabella in this movie. But nowhere is this issue more present than with Candace, who essentially has two different arcs that are sort of connected. But it doesn't matter since both of them are pretty much immediately forgotten about until the very end. We start the movie with Candace learning Jeremy is already looking at colleges, which sends her into a spiral where she starts worrying if she's mature enough. Then immediately gets sidetracked when Stacy says she's old enough to bust her brothers herself. Then we mostly drop the whole maturity complex so Candace can fixate on the idea of the mysterious force, leading to her entering the second dimension. Then we get a talk with other dimension Candace about what growing up actually means. Then the movie kind of forgets about Candace until they remember they forgot to give any of her storylines some kind of conclusion, so instead they turn her entire presence throughout the movie into one big joke. It's clear to me the biggest issue with this movie is how overly ambitious it is with everything it tries to pack into a 70-minute runtime. It very much needed an extra 10 to 15 minutes to smooth everything over and give all these elements room to breathe. But there was no way Disney was ever going to allow an extension to a movie based on one of their biggest franchises at the time, because that would make sense. However, those really are only small issues. And the only reason I had so much negative to say is because when you've seen this movie as many times as I have, the negatives start to stick out a lot more over time. Still, that doesn't even leave a scratch on what, at the end of the day, is a terrific TV movie that satisfies die-hard fans, and I think still has enough enjoyment factor for people who haven't even seen the show before. We haven't found anyone who fits that description yet, but we'll keep looking. What continues to surprise me about this film is just how well it compares to other TV movies based on cartoons. You see, when these movies are given the go-ahead by the executives, they are ordered on top of the current season, so the show's team is simultaneously working on both the movie and new episodes of the show, which leads to a lot of cooks in the kitchen if you catch my drift. Now, they're still good movies of course, but not as consistent as one would hope a feature-length adventure would be. So for Phineas and Ferb Across the Second Dimension in Fabulous 2D to tell a fully coherent story from beginning to end, almost never missing a beat and having every joke/emotional moment land how the people making it wanted it to, that is something really special. I mean, Phineas and Ferb is a storyboard-driven show, and this movie had 15 storyboard artists. I don't want to call the end product a miracle, so I won't. Because this was a year's worth of passion and effort from those involved who created something truly amazing that 10 years later still stands as one of the greatest movies based on a cartoon. And that's something to celebrate. And celebrate they did, as upon the film's premiere it received an impressive 7.6 million viewers and would go on to be the highest rated cable movie of that year. With a movie this big and successful, it was naturally going to leave a lasting impact on the series going into the second half of its run, and despite the fact all the characters got their memories wiped at the end, yeah, this movie definitely left an impact on the show. With Across the Second Dimension, Dan and Swampy broke almost every single rule they had created since they first began developing the series 20 years prior. And they understood that even though they gave the cast amnesia, returning to the same status quo of keeping the Flynn, Fletcher and Doof worlds separate would not have worked as well as before. In essence, the floodgates had been opened, and from here on, we would start to see their paths cross a lot more frequently, most notably with the development of Candace and Vanessa becoming friends. Which is another cool thing about the later seasons, as they experimented with a few ongoing story arcs focused on side characters, which was surprisingly effective and helped keep things fresh. From here the show would also start telling much more complicated stories rather than always following the tried and true formula. This would be noticeable in the usual 11-minute episodes, but would be impossible to ignore in all the double-length and hour-long specials Disney started ordering, which heeded mixed results, including a pseudo-sequel titled Tales from the Resistance.
But that's another story.
I'll be covering that and everything else next year as part of my contribution to the show's 15th anniversary. All you need to know now is that prior to Across the Second Dimension, the biggest storyline the show had ever attempted was Summer Belongs to You, which when you get down to it is just a case of the characters landing somewhere in the world, finding some new thing to keep them going, and then moving on to the next location. It's essentially a 40-minute Little Einsteins episode. But then you get to seasons 3 and 4. Suddenly the boys are building an escape tower that then tries to kill them, doing Halloween specials, and getting scammed by criminal aliens who trick them into body swapping. Yes, seasons 3 and 4 get a little bit crazy, but the immediate thing you'll notice starting with this movie and season 3 is a shift in the show's humour, leaning towards being much more self-referential and constantly breaking the fourth wall. Now, I should point out, this obviously didn't come out of nowhere. Since the early episodes, this series has loved occasionally poking fun at its world and just the absurdity of everything. I mean, one of the last episodes of season 2 is about the characters being bored one day, so they decide to remake the first episode but as a musical. But season 3 kicks that into full overdrive mode, with almost every episode having multiple fourth wall breaks where the entire joke is just the characters pointing out some trope or inconsistency. And now this humour is what a lot of people remember the series for, and they are smart, funny jokes with great timing and delivery from the voice actors. Yet, in my opinion, this also leads to the show losing some of that charm and innocence of the earlier episodes. Seasons 1 to 2 are very much the characters driving the comedy. The series occasionally gets a really good laugh, mostly from Doofenshmirtz, but that's not the focus. It's all about sending these characters on fun adventures that harken back to the kinds of things we wanted to do as kids. Build a roller coaster, search for treasure, colonize Mars. But moving on to the later years, it very much becomes the comedy driving the characters, with the goal now being to tell as many jokes as possible. Which that, and the writers starting to become strapped for ideas towards the end, leads to the boys' inventions losing their initial relatability. Now they're untying giant knots and rounding up mutant potatoes. Over time, the show becomes kind of obsessed with the small details and pointing out every logical fallacy, leading to episodes that are still a lot of fun but don't stick with you as much as the ones from the first half of the show. But that might be just because I binge watched the entire series over 3 days last year. And when watching everything back to back, the move to a much more snarky and self-referential tone becomes very apparent. Wasn't this video about Across the Second Dimension? Phineas and Ferb Across the Second Dimension in Fabulous 2D is not only a really well put together and expertly executed feature-length adaptation of one of the most iconic cartoons of the late 2000s, but also had a significant hand in revitalizing the show, opening the doors to so many new ideas that could be explored and giving way to more attempts at telling similarly ambitious stories, for better or for worse. In fact, it can probably be argued that we have this movie to point to as being directly responsible for the second half of the show's life, as it gave the series a much needed shake-up that helped the franchise maintain its popularity through to the very end and even after. I also consider this movie to mark the end of 2000's Disney Channel, as less than a year after the film's release, the network would premiere a new cartoon called Gravity Falls, which would go on to change Disney TVA and television animation as we know it forever. And if this movie is to be defined as the end of an era, I can't think of a better way to go out. But of course, the biggest impact left by this movie is that 9 years later and 5 years after the show ended, Candace Against the Universe would premiere and would go on to make a different kind of splash. However, we'll come back to that at the end of the month, because if you thought I had a lot to say on this movie, just you wait. If you're new around here, feel free to subscribe and comment down below as it helps me out a whole lot. Thanks so much for watching, folks, and I'll see you real soon.